It is being hosted by the Regional Educational Laboratory Northeast Islands, and in particular by the English Language Learners Alliance, which is a part of our Regional Educational Laboratory. And now, I'm going to pass this off to Maria Paz Avery, who will introduce you to the event.
Thank you, Rebby, and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the English Language Learners Alliance at REL Northeast Islands, we welcome you to our bridge event this afternoon. I'm the facilitator for the English Language Learners Research Alliance, and I am here with my colleague, Dr. Caroline Parker, who is a researcher for the Alliance and co-author of the study that we are presenting this afternoon. The English Language Learners Alliance has been in existence for 5 years, and working with a core group of members from our states in the region, we have determined that our primary goal was to arrive at a deeper understanding of the diverse needs of our very diverse population of English learner students. Over the past 5 years, we have focused on 3 strands of work. First, and I will show it to you in this infographic that we developed to show all the work that we have done over the past 5 years. First, we started by examining the connection between the characteristics of our students and their outcomes related to English language acquisition and the mastery of content. Second, we were looking at the understanding of the professional development needs of educators related to this population. And third, looking to improve the quality of the data gathered in order to be able to conduct studies of interest to practitioners. The study that we are featuring today, Patterns of English Learner Student Reclassification, contributes to our understanding of the diversity of EL student population and their trajectories to English proficiency. Let me just put up the agenda, which you saw earlier. We will be starting with a presentation by our lead author, Dr. Michael Kieffer, who will be presenting the findings of the study, Patterns of English Learner Student Reclassification using New York City data. And he will be sharing with you the findings of this study, followed by a discussion of the implications for instruction. While you are listening to the presentation, we encourage you to post questions in the chat room, as you will have an opportunity to hear answers to these questions during the question and answer periods. Our presenter, Michael, is an associate professor of literacy education at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development at New York University. Michael is a former middle school teacher, and he conducts research that aims to inform instruction and policy to improve the reading outcomes of students in urban schools, and in particular, adolescent English learners. Many of you have asked about SIFE students, and so a lot of his research applies to the work that one does with SIFE students. His current research interests include metalinguistic skills involved in vocabulary learning, sources of reading comprehension difficulties, and the role of attention in second language reading. Take it away, Michael.
Thanks so much, MP. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be here virtually, I guess, for all of us to be connected via the internet today. And it's great to see 66 participants showing up on a Thursday in the week after Thanksgiving. As MP said, I was a middle school teacher, and so I know how tough for folks working in schools it is to find the energy and time the week after Thanksgiving with everything going on to make time to have a little bit of a conversation, to think a little bit about the needs of our English learner students. So I appreciate everyone here. So our goals today are to first deepen your understanding of English learner students' progress toward reclassification, and I'll be sharing some findings from a very recent study that's just been released around students' time, how long it takes students to become reclassified, and the characteristics that relate to that. In talking about this goal, we'll be talking about it on two levels. So one level is around implications for instruction. So I see many of the participants today are ESL teachers or bilingual education teachers. So I really hope to, in talking about our findings about students' progress, to talk a little bit about what the instructional implications of that progress is. The second goal, though, is that, the second piece of thinking about English learner students' progress is around bigger issues around policy, particularly as we move into an era of transitioning from No Child Left Behind to the Every Student Succeeds Act. I see that at least a few of you are representing state educational agencies and are probably intimately aware of the changes that are coming into play with ESSA, or the Every Student Succeeds Act, as it comes to transition from No Child Left Behind, and I'm sure many of the teachers participating also are curious in how that will play out. We know that ESSA has changed a number of things and has given states a lot of flexibility in how they think about accountability and various sort of dimensions of how we serve our students. And there's certainly some opportunities for ESSA to improve the ways that we think about, measure the progress of English learners. So as I talk about the results, I'll say a little bit about what that means. And I'll encourage folks to ask questions about those as well if you have other kinds of questions about how this might relate. The second big goal, and this will be more the second half of today's session, is to learn about 4 research-based recommendations to teach academic content and literacy to English learner students. So these recommendations draw on another piece of work I was involved in with a panel of national experts thinking about the best practices and best instructional things you can do to accelerate students' progress toward English language proficiency as well as toward mastering academic content. So the first section today is talking about this question of how long students take to become reclassified. This comes from a report that, as I mentioned, has just recently been released, and you have access to it, the report itself, under the Download Today's Resources box on your screen, and I'll say a little bit about that report. So the context for this study is that it's probably not news to anyone in this room that U.S. schools are increasingly linguistically diverse. We have many more English learners in our classrooms, and we have English learners in classrooms and in schools where they weren't always, that are new destinations for English language learners. One challenge we've had in the past is that we haven't had high-quality longitudinal data sets that look over time, but recently, by having more access to these kinds of rich longitudinal data, it makes it possible for us to look at patterns in reclassification of English learner students as they become former English learner students. In the past, we've had sort of one snapshot in time. We've looked at maybe how many students are reclassifying 1 year, or looking retrospectively at our former English learners and seeing how long it took them. But we can now actually have better answers to these questions because we can look longitudinally over time. And then the other piece of context that is important is that as we understand reclassification a little bit better, it can inform policy and practice. As I mentioned, it can inform state and district policies on how we think about when to reclassify students, as well as policies around how we can think about more meaningful accountability at the state and school level for students' progress toward English language proficiency. In the past, under No Child Left Behind, students' progress toward English proficiency got a little bit ignored or became sort of put on the back burner sometimes as we had so much focus on the reading and math tests. I think under the new ESSA legislation, we have some opportunities, though the devil will be in the details, about how well states and schools are going to be held accountable for students' progress toward English proficiency. It can also help school-level decisions about which groups may require particular different types or particular services of instructional support. So our 2 big questions in this study were, first, on average, how long do English learner students take to become reclassified as former English learner students? Seems like a relatively simple question, but actually is a little bit complicated and requires this long-term longitudinal perspective. The second question is, how does this time to reclassification differ by particular student characteristics? And the 3 that we were most interested in are, first, their grade of entry into New York City schools, which wasn't always their grade of entry to the U.S., though in many cases it was. Second, their initial English proficiency when they came into school. And then finally, their disability status, particularly focusing on specific learning disabilities and on speech and language impairments, two disability groups that are most related to the questions around language and how that may play out in their reclassification process. The data were from data sets that are maintained here at NYU at a center called the Research Alliance for New York City Schools. We had almost 230,000 students who had entered New York City public schools between the fall of 2003 and the fall of 2010. And when they were entered, were initially classified as English learner students. And then we followed those students longitudinally for up to 8 years to determine how long it took them to become reclassified. The analytic approach, which if anyone wants me to nerd out and answer nerdy questions about the statistics, I'm happy to, but essentially it's a very strong approach for looking at these questions longitudinally and getting some really nice answers to them. The last thing I would mention, though, is that while these data are specific to New York City, and they're certainly specific to the assessments and criteria in New York State, I think a lot of the trends, and I'll comment a little bit on how some of the trends are certainly relevant across many states in the U.S. So our first big finding is that about half of the students who enter kindergarten as English learners were reclassified within 4 years. So what this graph shows is if you look along the bottom, this shows each year that students are entered. So this is students entering in kindergarten. And this is the probability of their reclassification, which you can think of as the percent of students who are reclassified. So in the beginning of kindergarten, none of them are reclassified. By the end of kindergarten, about 11%. By the end of first grade, close to 30%. By the end of second grade, close to 40%. And then by the end of third grade, or after 4 years, we've got a majority of students, a little more than half of the students. What that means is that we can think about, and this red line shows you where half of the students have become reclassified. This helps us understand that for an average student, or your sort of typical or median student, it takes about 4 years for them to become reclassified as English proficient. After that, different groups of students continue to be reclassified at rates sort of going on upward. Our second major finding was that the grade at which students entered seemed to matter quite a bit. It was very predictive of how long it took students to become reclassified. So in kindergarten, as I mentioned, it's about almost 4 years on average. In first grade and second grade, that's actually a little bit quicker. So we see students who are entering in these two grades actually are reclassifying in closer to 3 years. As we move later in the grades, as you might expect, students take longer and longer to become reclassified. So that in particular, students entering in grade 6 or grade 7 are taking almost 5 years to become reclassified. This matters for a couple of reasons. I think one reason it matters is because, as we might expect, the age at which a student starts to learn a second language might have something to do with what they're learning in that language. And part of that is just, as many people might think, well, it's easier for young children to learn a second language quicker than older children. And that's true to an extent, although there's some research that suggests it's less true than we may think it is. But the other issue is that English proficiency is a moving target. So to become proficient in 6th or 7th grade, you have to reach a much sort of higher level of English proficiency than the kind of proficiency we're asking kindergartners or first graders to reach. Particularly given that, as in all states in the U.S., New York's assessment for English language proficiency includes reading and writing, not just speaking and listening. We have pretty high expectations in the later grades for the kinds of things that English learners are supposed to be able to read and write before they become proficient or before they become reclassified. Another thing I would say about this that's interesting is it does suggest that for our students who are entering in these later grades, in 5th, 6th, 7th grade, they certainly need to, they may need some more targeted supports, and they may need some more extra assistance in order for them to become reclassified more quickly. And this is a pattern that I don't think is just true of New York City, but is true more broadly speaking, that we may need some more targeted interventions to really accelerate the growth of students who are entering in later grades. Another main finding is maybe a little bit more what you might expect, that students with lower initial English proficiency take longer to become reclassified. So that students who entered with more what we call below average English proficiency, so these are students who have pretty limited English or not scoring very well on the initial test. They take about 5 years. Students, again, with average is about 4 years. And then students with above average who are closer to that proficiency level are taking about 3 years to become reclassified. I don't think this is too surprising. And those of you who work in schools, probably this doesn't seem that surprising. But it is a feature that I think in the past has been sort of ignored by some of our policies and by some of our accountability systems. Fortunately, with ESSA, this is actually just this week, the U.S. Department of Education released their final regulations around ESSA plans that states will have to complete. And one of the requirements is actually that as states measure progress in English English proficiency, that they need to take into account students' initial English proficiency, so that they set somewhat different expectations for students. We don't expect students who come in with very limited English proficiency to become proficient at the same rate that students who entered who are much closer to the bar for English proficiency. Then our final finding is that students with disabilities took longer to become reclassified. So here, if we look at students without disabilities, they're taking between 3 and 4 years. Students with specific learning disabilities are taking between 7 and 8 years. And students with speech or language impairments are taking about 5.5 or 6 years on average. So again, this is on average. So some students, even within each of these groups, are going to be reclassified more quickly than others. Some are going to take longer than others. But all of this is important to sort of keep in mind in thinking about our English learners with disabilities. This is a feature that we certainly need to also think about as we're sort of setting expectations and thinking through time to reclassification. I want to be clear, though, that this doesn't necessarily mean that it's not straightforward how to interpret this as either that the disability was preventing them from becoming English proficient, or that, on the other hand, maybe being in ESL or being in bilingual programs made it more difficult for these students to overcome their challenges with their disability. I think neither of those are straightforward. What we do know is that students with disabilities do take a bit longer to become reclassified. So these implications I've already essentially mentioned, but as you might have heard and might expect, developing academic English proficiency is a long-term process. It takes often many more years than we might expect or assume. That the time it takes students to become reclassified differs based on the tests, based on their characteristics, but also on the tests and criteria used. So one thing we found was that these times to reclassification in New York City are a bit different than times that we found in other states. Estimates out of California, often students are taking more like 5 to 8 years to become reclassified. And that's in part because the tests and criteria used are different. We also found that these times of reclassification are a little bit longer than times of reclassification in New York City in earlier decades. So there was a research study that was conducted primarily before No Child Left Behind, when their tests and criteria were different, and they were finding also different times of reclassification. So it suggests that the tests and criteria used are really important. And then finally, for folks working in schools, it suggests that some English learners may need some extra supports, and particularly students who enter with lower English proficiency, who enter in these later grades, particularly 6 and 7, or English learner students identified with specific learning disabilities or speech and language impairments. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions and answers, and I know Carrie has been sort of monitoring some of these questions, and so I'm going to let her sort of moderate this.
After 4 years, if a student still had significant gaps, was reclassification now changing emphasis to look at other possibilities? And I think what that means is other possibilities of why the student was not being reclassified.
Oh, I see, such as RTI supports.
Yeah.
That's a good question. So I'll say that our study didn't speak to that question directly. I can give a little bit of information. I mean, our study suggests that I'm gonna switch back to the slide if that's okay. Our study suggested that after 4 years, about half of the students have become reclassified, but that means about half of them haven't, right? So I think what I would suggest is that the students who haven't reclassified by 4 years, it doesn't actually suggest that there is, it suggests that they may need some additional intervention, so response intervention kinds of approaches may be warranted. That said, it's still half of the English learner students. So as you think about that, it may not necessarily be that Tier 2 kinds of interventions are warranted. It may mean that we need to improve Tier 1 still, because it's such a large group of students who still need a little more time, if that makes some sense. So I don't think we want to necessarily assume that anybody who doesn't get reclassified within 4 years is struggling in any really substantial or major way. It means that it may mean that we need to improve instruction for sure, but it may not mean that that student particularly has a disability or is really even at risk for disability necessarily, in part because it's so many of them who still need that additional time.
Great. Okay, thanks. So the second question is a little bit different. Is the data based on literacy in L1 of the students as they come into the program? And also, did you include whether or not they had sporadic or interrupted schooling?
Yeah, those are both great questions. We didn't have access to those data, in part because we were looking back in time. We have some of those data in New York City, but only in the last couple of years. And because we wanted to look many years ago, we weren't able to look into that. I do think there's evidence in the research that does suggest that first language, the stronger your first language abilities are, particularly for students who are entering later, right? So for kindergartners and first graders, you know, many of them don't read and write in any language, right? And that's because they're kindergartners. For students who are entering later, then I certainly think that their prior schooling experiences, their reading and writing skills in their first language are going to be predictive of how quickly it takes them to become reclassified in English. And I know certainly in New York, we're making efforts to, the state is trying to make efforts to assess first language abilities in a more systematic way and in a way that can inform this a little bit better. We also didn't look at students with interrupted formal schooling. I do think that's also likely to play into this, and I think there's a reasonable reason to believe that they may take longer to become reclassified.
Great, and so what you're saying is that 5 years from now, there will be data that would allow us to do that kind of a study to include the variables.
I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, I think there's some information. There's some other kinds of studies that have looked at that a little bit. None of them have been able to do a great job of it because of the limitations of the data. Yeah, but hopefully in a few years we will be able to have a better answer.
Okay, great. There are a couple more questions about the data. One about how the students in the study were identified with specific learning disabilities prior to being in the study. So describe how that was determined, as well as what average initial English proficiency, how you define that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So on the first question, for this analysis, we looked at students who are identified with a disability regardless of when they were identified. In many cases, they were, I mean, all of the students were identified as English learners when they entered school. Some of them, particularly for speech and language impairments, had gotten identified before, if they entered school in kindergarten, had gotten the disability classification before that. But most of the students gained the disability classification later. Some of them before they were reclassified, some of them after they were reclassified. But essentially, the work I was presenting was having been diagnosed with a disability at any time. The second question about how we define average initial English proficiency. So in New York, at this time in New York, so New York has since changed their initial English proficiency test. At this time in New York, they used an assessment called the LabR, and it's not exactly the same assessment in every year. So we essentially looked at average English proficiency was the average for all of the students entering in that year in New York City. And then above average was sort of substantially above that, and below average was substantially below that.
Great, thanks. And so there's another question related to that, saying that because students are assigned to services in New York City based on proficiency level and not on their score, do you know how the time to reclassification differs for students who start at beginner versus intermediate versus advanced?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we didn't look at that in this study, in part because we wanted to do something across all of the grade levels. And the beginner versus intermediate versus advanced in the old regime under the Lab R, the previous assessment, they weren't necessarily the same at all of the grade levels, if that makes some sense. We also didn't have access to enough data using the NICETEL, which is the current initial English proficiency test, right? The NICETEL started, I believe, 2 years ago. And so we don't have enough years of data with that. I think ultimately that would also be a question. So with the NICETEL, how do we look at, with the NICETEL levels, how do we look at time to proficiency against each of those levels?
Great. Okay, and I think we have time for one more question before we move on. What is your response if a school says that their goal is to exit English learner students from services within 2 years, regardless of level or age?
Yeah. I think that's ambitious. I think as schools and as states set goals, they should think about how to be ambitious, but how to be ambitious within an understanding of how language development works. So to slide back for a moment, so let's assume the school you're talking about is an elementary school. For an elementary school, actually let me do this one. So for an elementary school, if they set that bar, that's going to be very ambitious for the students who are entering kindergarten. It's going to be probably pretty ambitious for these students, and so it's probably pretty reasonable for students entering in first and second grade, right? If you were talking about a middle school, to me that's a very, very ambitious goal because you're asking students to go, you're asking the school to change the trend from 5 years to 2 years. And to me that's the kind of goal that if you don't have success toward that is maybe actually going to be more frustrating than it's going to be a useful goal. So I think it's really important for schools and for states to set ambitious goals around time to reclassification. I think that's really important to ensuring that our students get good instruction. But I think it might be more logical for us to think about setting that goal as a year or two less than we currently are seeing rather than 3 or 4 years less. I think the other danger with saying everyone should be reclassified in 2 years is that it suggests that there are not other long-term goals that students might be able to take advantage of. For instance, developing their skills in both languages, which in bilingual programs they'll have opportunities to do that, which they may not if they get quickly exited out of these programs.
Okay, great, thanks. So there are a few more questions, but let's go ahead and move on to the next part of the presentation, and we'll come back to these questions in our next Q&A period.
Great. All right, so now as I transition to a little bit of the recommendations around instructional practices, these recommendations come from a national panel that was organized a couple of years ago. I served on this panel along with a number of other researchers at various universities across the country, as well as teacher specialists and curriculum support specialists who had years and decades of experience working with English learners and working with school districts. And this was really a labor of love because what this report was and what this panel was we got together and we looked at all of the most rigorous studies that had evaluated instructional approaches, so different than the study I just described. These are studies that were conducted in classrooms and schools and that looked at particular instructional approaches and compared them to other instructional approaches or to sort of what we call business as usual. So they took a particular kind of intervention that sounded like it should be promising for English learners. They tried it out and they compared their results on students' outcomes to what other schools or other classrooms were doing. And over the course of a number of years, we looked at all of that research. We came together and we had many sort of discussions and debates about what the research was telling us, and we synthesized them into 4 key recommendations. So today, I'm going to give you just really a preview of what's in this report and a preview of, as well as some additional resources that you can learn more. Before I get into the recommendations themselves, I want to say a little bit about literacy development, English literacy development for English learner students, and partly as a way of context to understand the recommendations. So many of you may know a lot about this, and many of you, so this may be a refresher or just a reminder. For others, this may be a little bit newer or a little bit new way to think about the question of literacy development for English learner students. So if we start with a big question like what is reading, there's lots of different ways to answer this question. There are, of course, lower order skills that are involved in reading. So in order to be able to read a word like high or speed, you're going to have to break that word down into sounds. You're going to have to learn that high is in a family of words with sigh and thigh, where the letters make the same sounds. And you're going to have to not just learn to decode these words, but you have to learn to decode them pretty automatically, so that by 5th grade, for instance, students should be able to read about 115 words correct per minute. Of course, reading means much more than that. It's much more than just decoding words. It means using cognitive strategies to figure out the meaning of what's going on. It means having interest and motivation in what you're reading. It means using your understanding of language and your relevant background knowledge to make sense of the information in a text, as well as having a wide enough and deep enough vocabulary to really make sense of what's going on here. So if we look at this example of an article about high-speed trains, and we see this word service, we look it up and we see, well, there are 14 different meanings of the word service. So knowing this word service well means not just knowing one meaning of it, but knowing multiple meanings of it and how the particular meaning used here is appropriate. So those skills break down into two big and different problem spaces. So the first problem space are the skills that go into basic reading skills or code. So these are concepts about print, the ability to hear and work with spoken sounds, alphabetic knowledge, word reading and spelling, and fluency. So these are pretty commonly known by many elementary school teachers. The other big problem space is around knowledge and meaning, so concepts about the world, the ability to understand complex ideas, and vocabulary. Both of these go into what we call literacy, or reading and writing skills, built on a foundation of listening and speaking skills. The reason this is important for English learners is because these skills, these code-based skills, English learners must learn these skills, just as all readers need to learn these skills, and some may struggle. But on average, they don't struggle any more than monolinguals do. So we have quite a bit of evidence now that English learners don't struggle with sounding out words or becoming fluent readers as much. Some of them struggle, but no more often do they struggle than native English speakers. On the other hand, knowledge and meaning, many English learners will struggle with this problem space when they're working in English, at least. That on average, many English learners have less sophisticated English vocabularies than native English speakers, and they may have fewer sort of relevant pieces of background knowledge and experience to bring to bear on the reading challenge. The other piece to keep in mind, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, is that reading changes over time, that reading a simple text in 1st grade about a train trip is different than reading a more sophisticated paragraph about a text in 5th grade. And then by high school, reading a complex social studies text about economic and governmental forces and how they have an impact on the American Railroad is quite different. That texts become more sophisticated in the ideas that they include, but they also become much more sophisticated in the language demands that they require. So helping an English learner navigate the basic English demands of a 1st grade text is going to be quite different than helping an English learner navigate the more sophisticated and academic demands in high school. So with that background, and before I jump into these 4 big recommendations, I'm going to turn over to Carrie, who's just going to do a quick poll about your current practices. And so we have 4 questions, and these are all related to the 4 recommendations I'm going to be talking about. But I want to get a sense, particularly because we don't have too much time today, about your current practices. So let me turn it over to Carrie.
Yeah, so I can see people are already beginning to fill this out, and this is very helpful because it's going to help Michael decide which of the practices to focus on in the limited time that we have. And looking quickly, I can see that people are answering the first question first. So there's some pretty good confidence about teaching academic vocabulary. There seems to be a little bit less confidence about providing interventions for English learner students who are really struggling, as well as teaching writing. So keep filling it out. I see people are take your time if you want to take a few minutes to think about each of these. So, okay, I think people might be finishing up, and so it looks like it seems like the bottom 2 are the ones where maybe people have a little bit less confidence, but clearly we're the people on this web do the rest of the presentation.
Great, thanks, Carrie, and thanks everyone for filling out that poll. It does help us quite a bit. So as I mentioned, the report, which folks can look into, has quite a bit of information, not just sort of research. It actually is written. It's called a practice guide because it's meant to help teachers really understand these practices. So it has illustrations and it has nice vignettes to help teachers understand specific strategies they can use in each of these domains. So I will spend, based on that poll, I'm going to spend a little less time on the first two recommendations and a little more time on the latter two recommendations. But I do encourage folks to look at the practice guide, and we'll say a little bit more about other resources. So the first recommendation is around academic vocabulary, which is something that folks said you have a variety of confidence in, but maybe a little more confidence in some other dimensions of instruction. And the recommendation is to teach a set of academic vocabulary words intensively across several days using a variety of instructional activities. So let me unpack each of these a little bit. So one is the idea that for English learners, it's really important to emphasize academic vocabulary words. So by that I mean academic vocabulary words are words that are important to academic text. They go beyond the sort of basic English proficiency and basic sort of interpersonal conversational skills. It's important to pick a relatively small number of words that you can work on intensively so that you can spend more time per word. And it's important to use a variety of instructional activities. So a couple of quick steps in this. So first is that we know from research that it's useful for this to be based in text. It's based in informational text is often quite useful, and that it's engaging text. Second, that, as I mentioned, choosing a small set of words so that you can really focus on them in depth. A third key step is to think about multiple modalities, so writing, speaking, and listening. So rather than just teaching vocabulary in the context of oral performance or in the context of reading, getting students opportunities to use these words in multiple ways in their writing activities, providing opportunities for students to do a lot of work in pairs and in small groups to talk through word meanings. I'm going to skip over this. And then the final step is that it's important for students to be able to teach word learning strategies that help students independently figure out the meanings of words. So I'm sure many of you do this using context clues. The three big strategies that have the most base in the research are context clues, when it's appropriate, using word parts, so finding out how words relate to each other, so how investigate relates to investigation, and how exhibit relates to exhibition. And then for students whose language backgrounds make it possible, thinking about how to use cognate, so how to build on students' first language opportunities as a word learning strategy. So we know from research that many students have great abilities to see connections across their two languages, but that other students may need some help in pointing out and making use of those kinds of resources they have in their first language. So the second recommendation is to integrate oral and written English language instruction into content area teaching. And again, this is a recommendation that folks said they had at least some confidence in, so I'll do it a little bit quickly. Some of the strategies that research has suggested in thinking about integrating language with content area instruction are to use certain kinds of instructional tools and to use them really strategically. So tools such as short videos or visuals or graphic organizers are great at anchoring instruction and helping students make sense of content. So strategic use of a brief video clip, we're not talking about playing a video for an entire period, we're talking about a 4-minute clip that students then have a discussion about, is really useful to build common background knowledge and to anchor the instruction that's going to happen later. Paying explicit attention, not only spend more time where students have the chance to write. I think one way we may have gone a little bit wrong, or we may have had some problems in the last couple of years, is that we've had such a focus on reading, in part potentially because of state accountability and the emphasis on reading assessments, that we just simply, teachers spend less time teaching writing and less time giving students opportunities to write. So I think one thing we can certainly do for English learner students for whom we want to not just develop receptive skills like reading and listening, but we want them to ultimately develop productive skills with the language in terms of both speaking and writing, is to give students more opportunities to write and to scaffold and structure those appropriately. So some key steps based on the research that would be helpful in thinking about this. The first is to provide writing assignments that are anchored in content and focused on developing academic language as well as writing skills. So if you look at the report itself, the practice guide itself, there's a really nice example of a classroom in which the teacher is teaching about some social studies content about U.S. involvement in World War II. And to do that, the teacher uses this great book called Sudoku and the 1,000 Paper Cranes, which some of you may know, which is a really nice piece to get into this content. So we're starting with rich content that's worth learning, some ideas that are worth talking about and discussing. And then in providing a writing assignment, the teacher is starting with both content objectives around how to think about U.S. involvement in World War II, how to think about the climax of this text, and how to take the perspectives of different characters in the text. But they're also thinking about language skills, so how students will write a response where they have to take a particular stance, a particular position on an important aspect of the reading. The second step is that for any writing assignment, teachers should provide language-based supports to facilitate students' entry into and continued development of writing. And I think many of you may already do this, but to do things like use sentence starters that can help students first orally maybe, and then into their writing, compose their thoughts in different ways and push their thinking in different ways. So if we're asking, for instance, if we're asking students to tap their prior knowledge, give them a sentence starter like this relates to, or this reminds me of. And then as we move students, and we may use those sentence starters, and this was certainly something I did as a teacher, use those sentence starters first in a think, pair, share, where students use them in their speaking, and then later move to using them in their writing, so that we can help students write not just in complete sentences, but in increasingly complex complete sentences. At the paragraph or essay level, we can think about paragraph frames. So on the right-hand side, you see a writing framework that helps students organize their writing by providing and scaffolding a little bit of that process, both helping students understand how each section of a writing piece might work, but also giving them some of the language they might need to do that. The third step is to use small groups or pairs to provide opportunities for students to work and talk together on varied aspects of writing. So in this lesson on Sudoku and the 1,000 Paper Cranes, the teacher chose a sequence where they first read the story together. They then had an opportunity to write on their own about a challenging question about, was Sudoku's family right to blame the U.S. for her death? And then the next step was for students to discuss together. So this is a rich, challenging question that students can have different positions on and have rich debate about, and then they have another opportunity to write. So integrating speaking into writing is really essential here. And then the final step that's important to writing is to provide assessment that gives students positive and constructive feedback, as well as identifies their needs on both content and on their productive language skills. The last recommendation is around small group instructional intervention. And this is from a number of studies that had targeted students who are both English learners and are struggling with literacy in particular. So particularly, many of these studies were conducted in early grades, and were students who were, and many of them were conducted in a sort of response intervention or RTI framework, but are looking at students who seem to be making persistent difficulties in literacy. And there are 4 key steps that are identified across the studies as being really essential to small group intervention for students who are struggling. The first is that on the assessment level, schools and teachers need to use multiple tools to identify students who demonstrate persistent struggles with aspects of language and literacy development. And you'll see that I've highlighted that word persistent there. That's not a mistake. That's, I think, really important to this, is as we think about assessing our English learners, we know that language learning is a long-term process. We also know, though, that some students are going to have persistent difficulties in basic foundational skills in reading, and that we want to provide appropriate intervention. So if we identify students who are having persistent struggles after being taught, and this persistent doesn't necessarily mean over years. It could be over a couple of months in a first grade classroom. But persistent means that we're assessing students, we're monitoring their progress, and we see that they're persistently having difficulties with particular aspects of reading and writing. That we target that content. So this goes back to the point I made a little bit earlier, that code-based skills around decoding words and becoming fluent in sounding out words are different than meaning-based skills, and we need to differentiate that intervention. So what I sometimes see in schools is that I see all of the English learners, or maybe all of the English learners who aren't proficient yet on the state test, are all grouped together for intervention. Well, English learners have some things in common, but there are a lot of things that they don't have in common. They're actually quite diverse in this. You may have some English learners who I mentioned are really good at decoding words. They don't need any phonics-based or code-based intervention. Other students certainly need that, but they don't necessarily need, but they need something different than other students. So to think about, is your intervention targeting code-based skills, or is your intervention targeting meaning-based skills, is really important to sort of figure out and to make sure you're matching students to the appropriate interventions. Then for students who are struggling with code-based skills, so are struggling still to decode words accurately and fluently, who maybe need that more basic level of attention to phonics and word recognition skills, those students certainly need intervention in that area, but they also need attention to meaning-based skills. So we don't want to set up a system where students, in order to get some phonics intervention, or in order to get some sort of Tier 2 RTI type intervention for their reading skills at a more foundational level, they lose out on opportunities to develop their vocabulary or comprehension strategies. We want to make sure that's also sort of brought in and integrated. And then finally, for intervention, it's important to do thoughtful grouping. And one recommendation we make is that for code-based skills, homogeneous groups can be really useful. So as I mentioned, because not all English learners, or not even all English learners who struggle with reading comprehension, are doing it because they can't sound out words, but some certainly are struggling with sounding out words and code-based skills, we may want more homogeneous groups that target the smaller number of students who have those kinds of challenges. On the other hand, heterogeneous groups are probably really useful when we're focusing on more meaning-based skills. Part of that is because by having more heterogeneous groups that include English learners with different levels, but also potentially native English speakers and former English learners, students can have models for how to do higher level comprehension processing, where we can have more student-driven and student-led kinds of approaches to teaching reading comprehension. The kinds of things like collaborative reasoning approaches and reciprocal teaching approaches, where students are really helping each other to model and use comprehension strategy instruction. So intervention is an area that's quite challenging, and I know it's one that schools often are challenged with. I think part of what we need to do is build on what we are doing successfully, maybe with our monolingual students, apply some of that to our English learner students, but also realizing and thinking about the fact that English learner students are very diverse in their skills and needs, so we need to make sure we're assessing in a way that differentiates between their code-based skills and their meaning-based skills, but also that we recognize that English learners, even English learners who are struggling with code-based skills, they still are going to need rich exposure and rich opportunities to develop language and vocabulary and comprehension strategies. So just two last points, and then we'll open it up to questions, because I've been talking for quite a while. The first is that it's valuable to think about how these recommendations overlap with one another. So in particular, all of them have a shared focus on academic language and content, that when we're teaching vocabulary or we're teaching particular kinds of ways of using language, we don't want to divorce that from rich academic content, texts that are worth reading, ideas that are worth talking about. That those need to be integrated with scaffolding and support and varied grouping, as well as explicit instruction when it's necessary. So it may not be that for all things explicit instruction is necessary, but for some skills it's certainly going to be helpful. And that we have opportunities to integrate reading and writing and discussions in a more thoughtful and systematic way. So before we open it to question and answer, the last thing I'm going to just throw out is that there are lots of resources related to this practice guide that folks should take advantage of. The first, as I mentioned, is on the left here, is the practice guide itself, which is entitled Teaching Academic Content and Literacy to English Learners in Elementary and Middle Schools. As I mentioned, it has a number of specific examples and vignettes of classrooms of how to put these recommendations into practice. It also addresses potential pitfalls that teachers may encounter in putting these recommendations into practice, and it gives some solutions to those pitfalls. So for any of you who may be thinking now, well, that's great to talk about it, but what is it going to look like in my class? And here are some things I may struggle with. Their guide actually does a nice job of addressing some of those. The other key resource, and I'd really suggest people look into this, particularly people who want to make a commitment around maybe not all 4 of these recommendations, but maybe one of the recommendations or improving one of the areas that they feel less confident in, is what's called the Professional Learning Communities Facilitators Guide for this that's related to this practice guide. And that's on the right-hand side here, and the link is on the link is both in the chat box, and also you could just click on it right now on the slide if you'd like to. And essentially that practice, that's a facilitator's guide for you to do at your school sites your own professional learning communities around this kind of work. And I know some people are maybe more or less familiar with this idea of professional learning communities or PLCs, but the basic idea is that rather than professional development for teachers being always driven by people like me who sort of are coming in and talking at you, that instead your professional learning should be something that happens on a weekly basis at your school. And so what this guide does is it gives you a set of activities that as a group at your own school you can engage in building a professional learning community and using that community to focus on these particular recommendations to improve your practice in particular areas. So if, for instance, you think small group intervention is something you really want to focus on as a school community, something that you may not be doing as good a job with, you can focus on the part of the facilitator's guide that focuses on that recommendation, and it gives you specific activities. It also provides links to a lot of great video resources that provide models for how to do this. If folks are interested in that, the other thing I would mention is that there is an event coming up next week, which is a webinar similar to this one that's being hosted by the authors of the Professional Learning Communities Facilitators Guide. The link to that is in the left-hand side. It's hosted by a different REL, a different regional educational laboratory, and it's on December 7th. So if you take a look at that link and are interested in doing some work with a group of teachers at your school site to start to put some of these recommendations into practice, that would be a really nice way to start that off or to get involved in that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie to moderate the question and answer session.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. So I think we have time for just 2 or 3 questions. I'm actually going to start with a specific one and then move on to the more general ones. So there's a question whether there are specific tools that have shown greater growth, for example, foundations or RAS kids.
And by tools, so those are specific curriculum. Is that right?
Yeah. So foundations is for struggling readers.
Right. So we didn't in the What Works Clearinghouse Practice Guide. So the short answer is no. The short answer is that the practice guide and the approach of thinking about this was to try to think about principles that cut across different kind of curricula. Many of the studies that were included in the practice guide were not studies of published curricula, but were rather studies of curricula that were developed by researchers and may not have ultimately, they may have been developed by researchers. Some of them might have turned into published curricula. Others might have just informed different kinds of published curricula. So the short answer is that actually we don't have a lot of evidence for a lot of the published curricula that are out there, frankly. What I would suggest, though, is that as a school community, something you can do is you can take the kinds of principles that are in the practice guide, you can take your own professional experience and knowledge about how to teach different kinds of interventions, and you can use that to evaluate those kind of published curricula. So, for instance, if you're looking at an intervention for struggling readers, does it make this distinction between code-based skills and meaning-based skills in a way that makes sense for your students? If it doesn't, it may not be a great intervention, right? If the intervention says, well, this is an intervention that's great for all students, no matter what they're struggling with, that's not always the best or most targeted intervention. On the other hand, if the intervention materials say, after giving our assessments, you'll have a sense of which students need this kind of support in their phonics, which students need this kind of support in their fluency, and which students don't need that support and instead should focus more on vocabulary and comprehension strategies, then that might be a better kind of curricula to adopt. But in general, and it's sort of unfortunate, in general, a lot of the research is not based on, has not evaluated published programs to be able to say that one is that much better than the other. The other reason to that is that because published programs change so often, even the studies that have evaluated them, they've been many years ago, so they don't actually necessarily, even if someone says, well, 15 years ago this study showed that it was really effective, it may not be true of the curriculum anymore.
Great. Okay, thanks. So really the practice guide is giving you tools to evaluate the curriculum that you're looking at using with students.
That's right.
Great. Okay, so I think we'll finish with just one more question. How do you hope your findings will impact policy and best practices?
That's a big question. So I think on policy, and we're certainly in discussions, trying to have discussions here in New York around thinking about how this may, some of these findings can inform a lot of the efforts. In many cases, we've got some policy things happening in New York that do align with these findings and do align with what other research is showing. So I think one thing, if there are state folks who are still around, one way that we might think about this from a policy level is to think about how can our policies understand the fundamentally long-term nature of language development. So our studies, like a lot of other studies, suggest that this is a long-term process. And how can we be ambitious in setting expectations for students' growth toward reclassification, progress toward reclassification that are quicker than we might otherwise expect? How can we be ambitious and have high expectations, but also be mindful of the developmental nature of language? And so for folks who are at the state level or for folks who are in district levels thinking about policy, thinking about this from a policy perspective, I think that this kind of research is useful to thinking about, one size does not fit all, that we see that not only is becoming English proficient a long-term process for average students, it's certainly more of a long-term process from students with certain kinds of characteristics. So how do we set up a policy that takes that into account? One specific example of that is the earlier finding I had shown about middle school versus elementary school, or students entering in middle school versus students entering in the early grades. If you don't think about that in policy, what you're going to have is you're going to have a lot of middle schools labeled as failing, even if they're being as successful as elementary schools. And you might have some elementary schools that get sort of off the hook, that may not be doing a great job with their students, but sort of fly under the radar because their students simply entered younger and started learning English earlier. And so that's a piece of where I think this work might influence policy. In terms of practice, I think that thinking about language learning as a long-term process, but also thinking about, well, what can we do, particularly in terms of these 4 recommendations that can help accelerate students' progress toward those long-term outcomes. And I think that's less about these recommendations than it is about the conversations that these recommendations will start. So I think the Professional Learning Communities Guide is really important because these recommendations, I think, are really a starting off point for teachers to start to look at their practice and to say, oh, you know what, actually, maybe this is right that we're not doing a great job with writing for English learners. So let's really focus on that and think about not just what research says is effective, but what we're finding is effective in our classrooms. How can we share those best practices with each other, and how can we start to improve how we're serving our students?
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And I'm seeing in the chat that people are sharing a lot of resources relevant to all the different things that you've been talking about. So I'm glad to see there's lots of interaction going on here. Michael, thank you so much. I'm going to turn this over now to MP to finish up the webinar. MP, are you there?
Thank you very much, Carrie, for moderating the question and answer period. And Michael, thank you so much for sharing the results of the study as well as the implications for instructional practices and the recommendations from the practice guide. Thank you also to all the attendees for sharing their information about things that have worked for them, strategies that have worked for them, the resources that have worked for them. I would like to now remind you to please fill out the SurveyMonkey survey that we have. It's very important for us to get your feedback. We take your feedback very seriously in order to continue to improve the webinars that we offer as part of the REL. And with that, I would like to thank you all very much. Some of you are still typing, and that's great, but our webinar is now officially ended. Have a good day, everyone.